Operation Hunger, the women who fed a dying army. December 15, 1944. Stalag XYB, Austrian Alps. Temperature, -12 degrees Celsius. The war was dying, and so were we. I found this journal buried beneath the floorboards of Barrack 7, wrapped in oilcloth and hidden for 80 years. The handwriting belongs to Eleanor Shaw, a British Red Cross nurse captured during the retreat from Normandy. What she documented was never meant to be found. Eleanor's voice reading journal entry *. Today marks our 127th day in this frozen hell. The Germans are starving too now. Their eyes have changed, hollow, desperate. But we've discovered something they don't know yet. Something that could save us all, or get us shot. The official records show that 847 women died in Stalag XYB during the winter of 1944. What they don't show is how 1,200 others survived against impossible odds. This is the story the Wehrmacht tried to bury. This is the story of the women who turned starvation into rebellion, compassion into warfare, and bread into bullets. But every war story begins the same way, with the moment everything changes forever. October 3, 1944. Eleanor Shaw stepped down from the Wehrmacht transport truck, her Red Cross armband torn but still visible against her mud-stained uniform. Around her, 43 other women. Nurses, resistance fighters, a French baker named Marie Dubois who'd been caught hiding Allied airmen in her basement. The camp stretched before them like a wound in the earth. Stalag XYB housed over 3,000 prisoners, mostly Soviet POWs, French labourists, and now them. The women's barracks sat isolated in the northeastern corner, surrounded by an additional ring of wire and watchtowers manned by increasingly nervous guards. Obersturmführer Klaus Weber stood at the gate, his SS uniform still pressed despite the deteriorating conditions. At 34, he'd been transferred here after losing his left arm at Kursk. His remaining hand trembled slightly as he reviewed the transport manifest. 44 enemy medical personnel and civilians, he announced to his subordinate, Hauptmann Friedrich Müller. The Führer's orders are clear, they work or they don't eat. But Weber's voice lacked conviction. The war was turning, and even the most fanatical SS officers could read the writing on the crumbling walls of the Reich. Eleanor studied the camp layout with trained eyes. 12 years as a battlefield nurse had taught her to assess situations quickly. The kitchen facilities were centralized, one main building serving the entire compound. The guards looked underfed themselves. And in the distance, she could see something that made her heart sink, a medical ward filled with German soldiers, clearly wounded and abandoned as the front lines collapsed. "You will be assigned to medical duties," Weber continued, his Austrian accent thick with exhaustion. "Any attempt at sabotage or escape will result in immediate execution." That first night, crammed into wooden bunks in Barrack 7, Eleanor whispered to Marie Dubois in broken French. "How many loaves can you bake with 50 kilograms of flour?" Marie's eyes, sunken but still sharp, flickered with understanding. "Depends what else we're putting inside them." The hunger begins. By November, the rations had been cut to 800 calories per day, barely enough to keep a person alive, let alone working. The women watched their own bodies begin to consume themselves, hip bones becoming sharp angles beneath tattered clothing. But it was the German medical ward that changed everything. Eleanor had been assigned to assist Dr. Hermann Kranz, a Wehrmacht medical officer who'd been treating wounded soldiers with increasingly limited supplies. At 57, Kranz was old enough to remember the First War, young enough to recognize the signs of the second one ending badly. "Nurse Shaw," he said one morning, his voice barely above a whisper as they stood over a 19-year-old panzergrenadier who'd lost both legs to a Soviet anti-tank mine. "I have morphine for perhaps 3 more days. After that." The boy's name was Johann Weiss. He'd been drafted 6 months earlier from a farming village outside Munich. In his delirium, he called for his mother, speaking words that needed no translation. Eleanor looked at Dr. Kranz and saw something she hadn't expected: humanity. "The kitchen receives supply deliveries every Tuesday," she said quietly. Medical supplies come on Thursdays. If someone were to miscalculate the inventory. Krantz studied her face for a long moment. Outside, artillery rumbled closer than it had the day before. I never had this conversation with an enemy prisoner, he said finally. But if I had, I might have mentioned that the kitchen storage room lock has been broken for weeks. The underground kitchen. The discovery came by accident. Marie Dubois, weakened by hunger, had collapsed while carrying laundry to the washhouse. As Eleanor helped her to her feet, Marie's hand brushed against a loose floorboard in the abandoned root cellar beneath the building. Underneath lay a forgotten space, perhaps 4 meters square, with stone walls that had once stored vegetables for the Austrian farm that existed here before the war. It was cold, hidden, and directly connected to the main kitchen through a crawl space behind the ovens. Mon Dieu, Marie whispered, running her fingers along the stone walls. We could cook here. Really cook. Within a week, 8 women knew the secret. Within 2 weeks, they'd organized what Eleanor began calling Operation Hunger in her hidden journal. The system was elegant in its simplicity. During their assigned kitchen duties, the women would accidentally drop ingredients, a potato here, some flour there, scraps of meat that were too spoiled for the main meals. Susan Mitchell, a Scottish nurse with quick hands, became expert at palming spices and salt. Anna Kolski, a Polish resistance fighter, proved gifted at creating distractions while others worked. In the root cellar, using candles stolen from the chapel and cooking pots borrowed from storage, they began creating real meals. Not just the thin gruel and black bread that kept them barely alive, but food that reminded them what it meant to be human. The first real meal they cooked was a soup made from stolen bones, salvaged vegetables, and herbs that Marie remembered from her grandmother's recipes. As the steam rose in the candlelit cellar, 8 women sat in a circle and wept. This is what we're fighting for, Eleanor wrote in her journal that night. Not just survival, but the memory of what life tastes like. The German connection. The moral complexity began 3 weeks later, when Dr. Krantz approached Eleanor with a request that would change everything. The boy, Johann, he said, his voice heavy with something between guilt and desperation. His dying. Not from his wounds, from malnutrition. The medical rations. He gestured helplessly. There's nothing left. Eleanor stared at him. A German officer asking an Allied prisoner to help save a German soldier. The irony was almost unbearable. Why? She asked simply. Krantz was quiet for a long moment. Because he's 19 years old, and his mother writes him letters about the apple trees behind their house. Because I took an oath once, and I'm still a doctor, even if I'm also a fool who believed in the wrong things. That night, in the root cellar, Eleanor presented the dilemma to her team. The debate was fierce, conducted in whispers and multiple languages. They are the enemy, Anna Kolski hissed in Polish-accented English. They killed my brothers, burned my village. He's a boy, countered Susan Mitchell. Probably forced into uniform like half their army. Marie Dubois, stirring a pot of soup that smelled like home, spoke the words that settled it: hunger has no nationality. Neither does mercy. The next morning, Eleanor slipped a small container of rich broth to Dr. Krantz. Johann Weiss drank it slowly, his eyes closing with something that might have been gratitude or simply relief from pain. He lived. Word spread carefully through the medical ward. Other German doctors, other wounded soldiers heard whispers of the British nurse who shared food with enemies. Soon, Eleanor found herself caught in an impossible web, officially a prisoner, secretly a lifeline for both sides of a dying war. The bread messages. By December, the operation had grown beyond simple survival. 22 women now knew about the root cellar. They'd established connections with prisoners in other compounds, trading medical supplies for ingredients, information for protection. But it was Marie's idea that transformed their kitchen into something approaching espionage. Bread lasts longer than soup, she explained, kneading dough in the candlelit cellar. And bread can carry things. Messages. Maps. even small tools. The technique was ancient: hollow out the center of a loaf, insert whatever needed to be smuggled, seal it with a thin layer of dough. The result looked like normal bread, but carried secrets in its heart. The first message was simple: camp layout and guard schedules, intended for the Soviet POWs in Compound C who were planning an escape attempt. Marie baked it into a dark rye loaf, indistinguishable from dozens of others. Eleanor volunteered to deliver it, using her medical duties as cover. As she walked through the camp, the bread hidden in her medical bag, she realized they'd crossed a line. They were no longer just feeding people, they were actively undermining their captors. The thought should have terrified her. Instead, it felt like the first genuine victory she'd experienced since Normandy. If you're still here, you're one of the few who seek the untold truths of war, so hit subscribe, and never miss what history tried to bury at asterisk. The moral collapse asterisk. Christmas Eve, 1944. The temperature had dropped to -18 degrees Celsius. The main camp kitchen had been without coal for heating for 3 days. Prisoners were dying of cold as much as hunger. In the German quarters, the situation was equally desperate. Obersturmführer Weber had received orders to evacuate the camp within 48 hours. The Soviet army was less than 30 kilometers away. But there were no trucks, no fuel, and nowhere to go. Eleanor found him that night, standing alone in the abandoned chapel, staring at a wooden crucifix that someone had carved years earlier. "Nurse Shaw," he said without turning around. His voice was hollow, aged beyond his years. "Do you believe in God?" The question hung in the frozen air between them. Outside, wind rattled the windows like the fingers of ghosts. "I believe in the obligation to preserve life," Eleanor replied carefully. "Even when that life belongs to someone who might kill me tomorrow." Weber laughed, but it was a broken sound. "Tomorrow? Yes, tomorrow the Russians will be here, and they won't distinguish between SS officers and Wehrmacht doctors. We'll all be war criminals to them." He turned to face her, and Eleanor saw something she hadn't expected: a man on the edge of complete breakdown. "I know about your kitchen," he said quietly. "The root cellar, the stolen supplies, the bread messages. I've known for weeks." Eleanor's blood turned to ice. This was it, execution at dawn, probably for all of them. "But I also know," Weber continued, "that you've been feeding German soldiers. Medical supplies to Dr. Krantz. Soup to boys who were drafted against their will." He paused, studying her face. "Why?" Eleanor chose her words carefully. "Because hunger is hunger, regardless of the uniform." Weber nodded slowly. "My son is 19. Same age as Johann Weiss. He's somewhere on the Eastern Front, if he's still alive." His voice cracked slightly. "If he's wounded, if he's starving, I hope someone shows him the same mercy you've shown our boys here." The next morning, Weber issued new orders to his guards. The women's work details would be expanded to include general camp maintenance. In practice, this meant Eleanor and her team now had access to the entire compound. The kitchen operation expanded immediately. The final gambit asterisk. January 15, 1945. The sound of Soviet artillery was now constant, a background thunder that shook the barracks and rattled windows. Evacuation was no longer possible. They were trapped between advancing armies and an Austrian winter that showed no mercy. In the root cellar, now expanded into 3 connected rooms, the women worked frantically. Not just cooking anymore, but preparing for siege. They'd managed to stockpile supplies for nearly 2 weeks, enough to keep the most vulnerable prisoners alive until liberation. But Eleanor knew it wouldn't be enough. The final plan was desperate, dangerous, and completely insane. They would approach Weber directly and propose a full collaboration, German and Allied medical personnel working together to keep everyone alive until the war ended. "It's suicide," Anna Korski argued. "The moment we reveal everything, we're dead." "We're dead anyway if we do nothing," Eleanor replied. "At least this way, we die trying to save lives instead of just prolonging the inevitable." The meeting took place in Weber's office on January 20. Eleanor, Dr. Krantz, and surprisingly, Hauptmann Müller, who had become an unexpected ally as the situation deteriorated. "I'm proposing we drop all pretense," Eleanor said, laying her cards on the table. "Your soldiers are starving. Our people are dying. The war is over, we're just waiting for the official announcement. Let us organize proper medical care and food distribution for everyone." Weber stared at her for a long moment. Outside, the artillery was getting closer. "If I agree to this," he said slowly, "and the SS finds out before the Soviets arrive, we'll all be shot as traitors." "If you don't agree," Eleanor replied, "we'll all die anyway, but slower and with less dignity." Hauptmann Müller spoke up unexpectedly. "Herr Obersturmführer, my brother died at Stalingrad. My son is missing somewhere in France. This war has taken everything from all of us. Maybe it's time to try saving something instead of destroying it." Weber was quiet for nearly a minute, the only sound the distant rumble of approaching tanks. Finally, he reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a key. "The main supply warehouse," he said, placing it on the desk between them. "Everything we have left. Distribute it as you see fit." Liberation *. February 8, 1945, 0630 hours. The 1st American tanks of the 11th Armored Division crashed through the main gate of Stalag XYB. Technical Sergeant Mike O'Brien of the 41st Tank Battalion expected to find the usual horrors: starving prisoners, mass graves, evidence of systematic murder. What he found instead was something unprecedented in his 2 years of liberation operations. The camp was organized, clean, and functioning. Prisoners moved with purpose rather than desperation. The medical facilities were operational, treating both Allied prisoners and German wounded side by side. And the kitchens were serving actual meals. "What the hell happened here?" O'Brien asked his commanding officer, Captain James Rodriguez. The answer came from Eleanor Shaw, who approached them wearing a mixture of prison clothing and medical supplies that somehow managed to look professional. "We decided to live instead of just survive," she said simply. In the days that followed, as the full scope of Operation Hunger became clear, military investigators discovered a network that had kept nearly 1,500 people alive through the worst winter of the war. Hidden in basements, concealed in walls, and baked into loaves of bread, they found 127 detailed maps of German defensive positions. Medical reports on Wehrmacht troop movements and morale. Supply manifests that had been misplaced to feed prisoners. Correspondence between German officers expressing doubts about continuing the war. And most remarkably, testimonials from German medical personnel praising the Allied women who had risked their lives to treat enemy wounded. The hidden truth *. Eleanor Shaw returned to England in March 1945, carrying her secret journal and the memories of 156 days that had changed her understanding of humanity itself. She never spoke publicly about Operation Hunger, never wrote memoirs, never sought recognition for what she and her team had accomplished. The official records were classified immediately. The story of Allied prisoners collaborating with German officers, even for humanitarian reasons, was too complex for a world that needed clear heroes and villains. The war had to have meaning, and meaning required simple narratives. But Marie Dubois kept baking. Returning to her village in Normandy, she opened a small bakery where she never charged full price to anyone who looked hungry. Anna Kolsky became a doctor, specializing in trauma surgery. Susan Mitchell dedicated her life to refugee relief work. Dr. Hermann Krantz survived Soviet captivity and returned to Germany in 1950, where he spent the rest of his career treating displaced persons and refugees. He never spoke about the British nurse who had helped him save German soldiers, but he kept a small piece of bread in his desk drawer until the day he died, a reminder of what compassion could accomplish even in the darkest of times. Obersturmführer Klaus Weber was captured by Soviet forces and died in a gulag in 1947. Among his personal effects, investigators found a letter addressed to the British nurse who reminded me what mercy looks like. It was never delivered. Johann Weiss, the 19-year-old panzergrenadier who had been Eleanor's first German patient, survived the war and returned to his family's farm. He lived to be 87 years old, never knowing that his life had been saved by enemy prisoners who chose compassion over vengeance. The legacy of bread. The bread messages were discovered entirely by accident. In 1987, during renovation of a building in Munich that had once housed displaced persons, construction workers found a cache of preserved wartime documents. Among them were dozens of the coded loaves, still intact after 42 years. When historians finally decoded the messages, they revealed not just military intelligence, but something more profound, evidence of a brief moment when the artificial divisions of war gave way to basic human decency. Today, in a small museum in the Austrian Alps, there's a display case containing Eleanor Shaw's journal, Marie Dubois's bread recipes, and a single preserved loaf containing a map of Stalag XVB. The placard reads simply, "In memory of those who chose to feed life instead of feeding death." But perhaps the most important legacy lives in the descendants of the people who survived that winter. Children and grandchildren who exist because strangers chose mercy over hatred, because women in a frozen prison camp discovered that the most powerful act of rebellion was the simple decision to preserve life. The war ended officially on May 8, 1945. But in a root cellar beneath a forgotten prisoner-of-war camp, it had ended months earlier, the moment Eleanor Shaw handed soup to a dying German boy and proved that humanity could survive even the most inhuman circumstances. War doesn't end when the guns fall silent. It ends when the last story is told. Sound fades to silence, broken only by the distant echo of wind through empty buildings. And in the end, perhaps that's the real victory, not the battles won or lost, but the stories that survive to remind us what we're capable of when we choose love over fear, mercy over vengeance, life over death. By connecting with us, we're going to bring you the real insights, the truths others won't show you.